Good morning. It is Wednesday, September 29th, and I want to turn our attention to Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of what happened in 1921 when a very, very wealthy Black neighborhood was ravished and destroyed completely, all because of a misunderstanding and false accusations of a Black man claiming that he harmed a white woman. And we've heard this story so many times when we research and look in the history of this nation. But in Tulsa, what was so unique is the Black economy that was so developed and that was thriving. In fact, some historians say $200 million in today's worth was taken from that community. And I had the opportunity to go to Tulsa for the centennial, the 100-year anniversary earlier this year. And the survivors of the Tulsa massacre are still fighting for reparations. They're still fighting to be compensated for their homes that were destroyed. 1,200 homes were destroyed. They're still fighting for compensation for their businesses that were destroyed. And yesterday, there was a court hearing, where the survivors of that massacre went in and asked a judge to consider the evidence that they were able to bring forth that would allow them to file reparations against the city of Tulsa. I want you guys to take a look at the latest coverage.
Civil and human rights lawyers will fight to keep a landmark lawsuit alive in court.
Hey, good morning, guys. A lawsuit filed by a group of Oklahomans is seeking reparations for the devastation caused by the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. Last night, a rally was held in support of that lawsuit. Attorneys for the plaintiffs will appear in court to defend motions to dismiss the case. Solomon Simmons has been critical of Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum for not supporting reparations in the past. The city does not comment on ongoing litigation. The lawsuit calls for monetary compensation and admission for the defendants that they created a public nuisance.
Asking that the judge allows us to move forward in discovery. That's first and foremost. We're asking for a declaration that this indeed is a public nuisance. We're asking for the judge to abate, which means to fix. So we're asking her to allow us to prove our case, show the evidence.
In a statement, the Justice for Greenwood Foundation said when no legal action is taken against acts of racial terror, that gives permission for it to happen again. Now, today's hearing is scheduled for 10 a.m. this morning. That's when they'll decide whether to move forward with the lawsuit or dismiss it altogether.
Black Wall Street, was about 35 blocks. 35 city blocks full of Black homes, Black businesses. It's now reduced to about a 1 or 2 block radius. And it is actually split by a highway. You know, when I went to Tulsa, it was shortly after the Derek Chauvin trial and the protest for Dante Wright, which was a very, very challenging time. And for some reason, I thought the centennial of the Tulsa race massacre was going to connect me with people who were advocates for Black economics. Somehow I thought that going to Tulsa was going to recharge me and revitalize me. In fact, I left infuriated because of the gentrification that has happened in the historic Greenwood district, because the fact that there were all of these events that were planned around the centennial, yet and still the survivors are still seeking reparations. The fact that you can charge for an event to celebrate the centennial of the Tulsa massacre, but none of the proceeds are going to the survivors. It felt very exploitative. And when you see the elders here in this coverage, these are elders who have dedicated their entire lives to fighting for reparations for the residents, the Black residents of Tulsa. And so, as we talk about the move for racial justice, we also must talk about the move for economic justice. Tulsa is just one example. It's probably the most well-known example But these massacres happened across our country in Detroit, in Chicago, and so many other cities. And so we can't stand here today, 100 years later, and say that we're changed if we can't unify on this history. Some historians have counted up to 300 people being killed on that 1921 day. And so if we know that not only was this a horrific act against a prominent, wealthy Black community, but we also know the cover up that happened to ensure that those people were not able to be to rebuild, or their descendants were not able to be compensated for the destruction that they were plagued with. The fact that for many, many decades, this history was known as a race riot. It was classified as a race riot, so that the descendants and the survivors couldn't go to insurance brokers and be compensated for what happened. There is a line in most insurance policies that prohibit compensation in a riot. And so it was a loophole. But we know that that's not what it was. And to hear the stories, too, to get closer to this history, I don't know, for those of you watching, how closely you've gotten to the history of what happened in Tulsa, but there were a few businesses that really stood out. There was one prominent hotel owner, Black hotel owner, whose hotel was destroyed, and he actually ended up being arrested, that some predicted could have catapulted with his company, a hotel like the Hyatt, or, any of these hotels that we see, the chain hotels that we see everywhere, the Holiday Inn, the Marriott, right? Because that was the type of service that he provided at his hotel. And that was also the business savvy that he had. So when we look at Tulsa, knowing that they're still fighting for justice, there are ways to support. If you know people in Oklahoma, reach out and see what you can do. But we're going to follow this hearing. The hearing was yesterday, and now the judge is deliberating on what he's going to decide to do. But this potentially could open up the door for residents to be able to sue the city for reparations, which would be a huge step forward for economic justice for those who were affected. I'm going to turn now to another story that is affecting anybody who is deciding to travel during this pandemic. If you've been on a flight recently, a lot of passengers are tense, and some are frustrated about having to wear their masks, which is basically creating a new problem that we didn't have 10 or 20 years ago. Take a look at this.
The FAA says passenger behavior investigations are reaching record levels. Last year, 183 passenger investigations were initiated. So far this year, 789 investigations have been launched. Today, a congressional hearing with airline employees and aviation experts detailed the scope of the problem.
The FAA, they are trying to stop this. They're trying to get harsher punishments. In some cases, it means fines of up to $45,000, depending on what you do.
Fists flying.
Why am I being arrested or detained?
Passengers detained.
Sit down, please. Go get him. Go get him.
Flight attendants harassed.
Aviation workers have to deal with everything from vulgar language, including racial epithets, to punching, kicking, biting, shoving, and spitting. It is disgusting.
The FAA and Airports Council International say there isn't one specific reason for the increase in air rage, but acknowledge COVID has a lot to do with it. Of the nearly 4,400 reports of unruly passenger behavior, about 3,200 were related to airlines' mask mandates.
I've lost count the times I've been insulted or threatened on a flight.
Flight attendant Teddy Andrews described one experience asking a passenger to keep his mask on.
He said, N-word, I don't have to listen to a damn thing you say. This is a free country.
The zero tolerance and the publicized fines has an impact. but we need more prosecutions.
I just spoke about an hour ago with Congressman Cahaley from Hawaii. He says that while he was actually in the hearing today discussing this issue, one of his staffers was in the air and their flight had to be diverted back to Honolulu because a passenger punched a flight attendant on that flight.
So I'm getting ready to travel to Hawaii, and I sure hope that we don't have an experience like that on our flight. But this is becoming a common occurrence on flights. People refusing to wear their masks, being rude, being disrespectful, being simply racist. And if you caught the one gentleman there who said, we simply need more prosecution. And so when you have individuals getting on these flights, knowing that they're not going to be prosecuted, also knowing that if you're midair, who is the authority while you're in flight? Who is going to arrest you right then and there? And so, if this doesn't get under control, we will begin to see some type of law enforcement officer on these flights in order to mitigate the violence that's happening, and to have someone on flight that can mitigate these instances. But with that, then also comes a whole slew of other issues, especially when we haven't even figured out how to hold officers accountable for using fatal force on ground. So I hope we don't have to get to that point, but I don't know what other choice airlines are left with, because flight attendants are not trained or equipped to break up brawls or to detain someone. And so it is extremely unfortunate when you juxtapose this story with Tulsa and the pursuit of justice. It just continuously reminds us that our country still has such a long way to go. The last thing I'll add here as I reflect on my time in Tulsa, if you ever go there, and I encourage you to go there, go to the Greenwood district. And when you walk downtown, you'll see bricks on the ground that have the names of all of the businesses that were destroyed. And it was so powerful to read those names. And I learned this is something that's not widely known, that there was a small rebuild that happened. And then the city of Tulsa used eminent domain to destroy the businesses that rebuilt so that they could build the highway. So definitely go to Tulsa. I'm going to turn to Ben now. He has an important interview he wants you to take a look at.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.patreon.com/The BPD Show.
We regularly talk about all of the different components that go into what we are considering to be a pan-reactionary movement. That simply means that there are people across the globe who are coming against modernity itself, against marginalized people, against progress. Alexander Reed Ross is an adjunct professor at Portland State University. He is also a fellow at the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right in the UK, and author of the book Against the Fascist Creep. And he's here to join us today to discuss someone in particular as it pertains to this topic, Steve Bannon, and all that we see happening across this country with regard to COVID-19. Alexander, how are you today? Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing great, Benjamin. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is ours. We've talked extensively about Steve Bannon, who was, or probably still considered to be, Donald Trump's henchman, but almost like Dick Cheney was to George W. Bush. I think, would you agree, it's safe to say that Steve Bannon is more of the Machiavellian hand behind what we see happening? That was, everyone gave credit to Donald Trump, but would you agree that Steve Bannon is the puppet behind a lot of the stuff we're seeing right now? Or the puppet master, rather.
The Muppet. He's definitely a Muppet. I think he is responsible for all the grassroots efforts you see with the Republican Party today. He is responsible as well for bringing back the faction of Americanism that had kind of been tamped down since the Nixon administration. And he's really been able to do that through the same kind of tradition, going back to Goldwater and before that, of, just populist kind of movement building, and so there's a mix with Bannon of an authentic grassroots experience that has been kind of carried over from the Tea Party and a complete farce of, astroturfed, like you said, kind of like puppet marionette kind of playing.
I think the thing that most people listening or watching would recognize immediately is what we see happening at school boards all across the country. We see groups of people who are organized. They have the same talking points, whether they are in Kentucky or whether they're in Florida. We see they come out saying the same sorts of things. And I heard this. There's a clip of Steve Bannon and a tweet, for that matter, where he's basically saying this is intentional. We're organizing this. Talk about this what looks like it's grassroots, but it is actually just it's really coordinated from a top down level. And Steve Bannon is a core player in that.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot going on at the same time. So he's helping to spearhead this kind of media attack, and he's constantly on his podcast, he's constantly bringing people in from the white nationalist movement, anti-immigrant movement. And they're big fans of like tokenizing people in order to kind of pretend that their politics are more harmless than they actually are. And then at the same time, there are sort of cells in different cities throughout the country, which come out and they're fully capable of bringing a different sign to each protest. So when it seems like there's a movement for this one kind of insurgency happening at one given time, it's pretty general, and that same group of people you'll see out the next month, targeting a completely different issue or group of people, right? So that gives the impression that you're seeing this real kind of the popular sentiment boiling over, when in fact it's just a highly mobilized fraction of the country.
Right. The sensation that it's a huge movement. Why? Help us to understand why COVID-19, why the anti-mask movement, why the anti-vax, why is there that overlap with conservative ideologies, particularly as it pertains to the organizers, Steve Bannon and Trump? It's like there's a perfect marriage between conservatism and COVID-19. Why that intersection?
They used to call it the cordon sanitaire, right? This line that you wouldn't break because otherwise, it would be this kind of infection of global politics. And Bannon is definitely outside of that. I think that what he is doing and what the Republicans in general are doing right now, basically just fostering this kind of militant opposition to, the federal government. It kind of harkens back to what conspiracy theorists have been doing on the far right for a long, long time, right? You have the same kind of theories that just sort of mutate and metamorphosize to incorporate new things going on. So there used to be this Agenda 21 that was the UN is going to depopulate the West by sending like Crips and Bloods house to house to disarm, honest patriots and then send them to FEMA camps in order to build a kind of eco paradise in the US West, right? So this is like an old school conspiracy theorist from like the 90s that really merges a lot of different, anxieties of the sort of white American who feels left behind or whatever trope. And today that's just sort of mutated to add the anti-vax stuff where, the vaccines have microchips in them that are going to be sent through a kind of 5G transmitter into receptors in your brain, and that will control you and keep you tame. And then, that's the extreme version. And then the other side of that is this sort of libertarian, like, this is a beta test for total liberal totalitarian domination over everyday life. So that's kind of where it is. It's like in the far right of the conservative movement, which has, there used to be a wall there, and that's just been completely breached. And now we have what we have.
Tell me about you gave it a specific name and I didn't catch it. What is the name of that wall that should not be breached, else we fall into the abyss of conspiracy theory?
The cordon sanitaire.